we're sitting here in New York on the day after Zohran Mamdani was elected. So let's start with that.
Yeah, the purge is outside.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
It's just chaos in the streets.
Well, as you know, both Francis and I have some experience with communism, so it's good to be back. But joking aside, what do you make of the fact that this has happened?
I think that there are cycles of history, and people don't remember things that have happened in the past, and so they tend to repeat the same mistakes. I think that we are now in a cycle of politics where perennial dissatisfaction is going to be the mode, meaning that we have an entire political class who are very invested in saying that a thing is the problem and then saying that they are the solution without actually offering any solutions. And then it turns out the thing they said was a problem is still a problem when they're done. And then people say, well, you didn't solve the problem. I'm going to give the other guy a shot to solve the problem. And I think that you're seeing that particularly with young voters. There's been a lot of talk about this is the most right-wing young and then it'll be like, no, this is the most left-wing young generation. And all that can be true if you're just kind of shifting side to side. And so the fact that everyone's flattering Mamdani by saying, well, he did talk a lot about affordability. And what I keep saying to people is, well, affordability is not like Beetlejuice, where if you just say it over and over, it suddenly arrives. You actually have to pursue policies that are likely to alleviate an affordability problem. But if your solution is always give me more power, and it does seem like that is the solution of the day from both sides, actually, then you're likely to just continue penduluming one side to the other. Because people don't want to learn the actual lesson, which is if you actually want affordability, then either you have to change policies or change locations. Those are really the only two things. And also, I think more broadly, it's not about affordability. We have trained an entire generation of people to believe that if their lives are not what they want them to be, it's the fault of systems, as opposed to decisions that are in their own control. And politicians absolutely have a stake in selling that. A lot of people in our industry have a stake in selling that. It makes people feel good about themselves and bad about the world. And the reality is, if you want a better life, you should feel better about the world and worse about yourself until you actually, go do the right things.
I broadly, generally speaking, as a matter of principle, agree with you. But I mean, I was looking around at property prices, real estate prices in New York. I'm doing pretty well for myself. I feel kind of poor looking at those things.
Oh, no, it's unaffordable. And I'm not saying it's not affordable.
Right.
It absolutely is unaffordable. And if you wanted to make a political difference, what you would do is you would relieve the building regulations. You would make it easier for people to build, not harder. You wouldn't rent control, because if you stop rent controlling, then that creates incentive for people to build. You would allow people to build up further. You would get rid of many of the code regulations that are kind of antiquated. Like there are things you actually could do. And then if you're a young person and you can't afford to live here, then maybe you should not live here. I mean, that is a real thing. Yeah, I know that we've now grown up in a society that says that you deserve to live where you grew up. But the reality is that the history of America is almost literally the opposite of that. The history of America is you go to a place where there is opportunity. And if the opportunities are limited here and they're not changing, then you really should try to think about other places where you have better opportunities. Again, that's not saying that public policy can't change. I think it can, but I think that the solutions being offered are untenable.
Well, I sort of see the problem with what you're saying is that really doesn't sound nearly as good as free stuff.
Correct. The third grade presidential campaign continues to win. It's undefeated, right? Free ice cream, free busing, free childcare, and free money paid for by somebody else. Well, what's likely to happen if Mamdani were to get his way? And he's not going, I think that the success of the Mamdani administration relies on him not being able to do anything that he says he's going to do. If those things happen that he wants to happen, he's going to empty out the city. It'll destroy the city. If he doesn't get those things, then it'll be really pleasant for him politically. He'll be able to blame the system for not being able to get done what he wants to get done. So the problems will stay the problems, but he'll just rail against the city. He'll be a perennial outsider, even as mayor.
Isn't that the kind of the default position of populism, where if you're saying that the problem are the elites and you can't get things done because of the elites, that just strengthens your position, doesn't it?
100%. Absolutely. I mean, and then you say, if only I were given more power, I could do this. And then you don't do it. And you say, well, because I needed more power. Like, if you'd just given me more power, that would have been awesome. One of the things I find really amusing about Mamdani, in kind of a cynical way, is when he does this, the coalition of the dispossessed, we're all going to come together, those of us with the bruised knuckles. And it's like, my dude, you haven't held a real job your entire life. I have a more successful rap career than Zoran Mamdani. And I'm not even joking, that's true. Right? Like, Zoran Mamdani is a failed rapper. He was a person who didn't hold a real job. He got elected to the assembly and ditched half of his votes. And now he's mayor of New York, having grown up in the lap of luxury in a country to which his parents immigrated. Like, he's been given the best of America, and his solution is America sucks and is terrible. And so now I'm going to quote Eugene Debs and Nehru in my inauguration speech, in my victory speech, which is what he did. Which, again, that's a take, but it just underscores one of the sort of fascinating things about revolutionary movements is they're very rarely led by members of the proletariat. They're very often led by, I would say, unsatisfied members of the bourgeoisie who then decide they must be the vanguard of the proletariat.
And it's so interesting, the young people's obsession with socialism, having seen socialism be implemented in Venezuela and then it being championed and lionized by particularly people of the British left, the Jeremy Corbyns of the world, et cetera, et cetera. And I've given up trying to explain the evils of socialism and communism to young people because I had a friend, a Cuban friend, who said, Francis, it's like a magic trick. And until you see the reveal, you ain't going to get the trick. And you need to see the reveal. And that's kind of what it's like, isn't it?
I think that's right, because it's so unthinkable. Like if you say to people, well, look at Venezuela. You say, well, it's not going to be like Venezuela here. Are you kidding? Like how? Like how? And the reality is it happens pretty suddenly. It's like the transition from, democratic capitalism to socialism, it does happen very quickly. I mean, once the government has the power to do these things, they do implement them very fast. And so what was unthinkable becomes suddenly just reality. And so most Americans also don't understand how it is that we became wealthy. They don't understand how we became a very prosperous country. They tend to think that how things are is the natural state of being, that wealth and prosperity and the nice things we have and these great new products every year and being able to order things on Amazon. Like that's why, one of my favorite comedy routines is Louis C.K. has this whole comedy routine about people complaining about flying in planes. Where he's like, we're all complaining, oh, it's just terrible, the conditions. Like your grandparents would have had to travel for 3 months to get from point A to point B, and you're doing it in 6 hours in a magical machine that flies in the sky. And you're sitting here complaining about that. And that's kind of human nature. Is what you see in your daily life is what you accept as the norm. And we do have these things called, airplanes that actively are time machines. You can fly to other places on Earth that don't have the things that we have. And you can look at the systems they've implemented and you can see why they don't have those things. But everybody who's growing up, listen, we're a spoiled society. Everybody who's been growing up, with all of this nice stuff, we think that that's the norm and that there's no way that norm is ever going to go away. And that's not true.
Well, look, I agree with you broadly in principle. However, when you talk about your grandparents, yes, our grandparents would be amazed by the smartphone and all of the other things you talk about. But our grandparents also could raise a family of 4 on a single income, have a house, have a car, and have a middle-class life.
So I think that there are a few things that are slightly a misnomer about that. So I think that number one, your grandparents, depending on when they grew up, in, say, the 30s, actually couldn't. I mean, your grandparents were dirt poor if they grew up in the Great Depression in the 1930s. That was a very, very bad decade. Sure. And then if they lived from 1941 to 45 in this country, then your grandfather was likely to be being shot at in either Europe or the Pacific. So those are rough years, turning those into sort of the golden age of what it was like to live in. So when people talk about this, what they're really talking about is a fairly short period of American history that existed essentially between the end of World War II and economically the rise of the rest of the world, when the rest of the world was basically in ruins. And so America could send a bunch of money to Europe and then produce all the products here because literally there was no industrial base anywhere else on planet Earth. They'd all been destroyed by World War II. And then you could work one income and you could still do that. That was actually not the way that virtually all work was done in the United States ever. I mean, if you go back to the 1910s or the 1900s when this was largely an agricultural society, mom was working on the farm, right? And when you're talking about problems of, for example, industrial labor, women were working in factories. And so this kind of brief period in American history, which was actually sort of an outlier in terms of all world history, and treating that as like the norm is not true. Second of all, the housing affordability crisis, the average house in the United States is significantly nicer, significantly larger with central air. If you looked at the house that your grandparents were living in 1952, you would say this place is a box. This place is bad. And if you look at the job that your grandparents were working in 1953 at the Ford factory, you sitting in your comfortable office, your air-conditioned office, complaining about your sciatica from your uncomfortable office chair, and then you're like, oh man, I'm really longing for those days of riveting. That is not an easy job. And by the way, it's not because we shipped it overseas, because machines do it now. Right? And so again, this is not to say everything is perfect, because it isn't. But I think that having a false picture of the economic past leads to bad conclusions about the economic present that are not supportable by the actual data.
You make good points. I guess what I'm saying as well is, like, if you look at the other candidates in this election that Mamdani's just won, you did not have the same level of speaking to people's concerns about some of those issues.
I agree. I mean, empathy sells in politics and also makes for very bad policy. Because as many people have noted, empathy is about the person in front of you and feeling what that person feels. And that's great politically, right? I mean, that's what makes people magic in a room. But when it comes to making a broad public policy, then it's really what is the most effective policy for the greatest number of people. And if you get empathetic about like this individual, you're very likely to make a bad policy that is specifically designated to help this individual at the expense of many other individuals, because anybody who says they're empathetic toward all humanity is lying. I mean, that's usually not true. You're empathetic toward others. It's a little self-serving. And so again, I'll give Mamdani credit for magically shaking the hands of cab drivers and kissing babies and being very, very good at that. But I'm not sure why that makes for good policy in any way, shape, or form.
But what it does show is the importance of charisma, and how if somebody is charismatic, you know, we've had people on the right, and I talk to people on the right person, they're like, oh, you know, Mamdani's this and he's that. And I'm like, can we just not accept that as a campaign politician, he is 100% undeniable?
He's terrific, particularly in short spurts. So I think the debates, the last couple debates, I didn't think they needed great, because there, you know, he was asked questions and he really couldn't defend himself. But I don't think debates matter anymore, because that's not how anybody consumes information.
That's right.
Right. The podcast space may be the last space where people consume in long form information, and even there, it's clips from this show that are going to go viral on X, right? And so if you're Zoran Mamdani and you put on, you know, what I think is kind of a smarmy grin for 2 hours, but the thing that gets clipped out is 30 seconds of you grinning. 30 seconds of grinning isn't smarmy, it's charming. 2 hours of grinning is rictus-like. And so I think that the shrinking of the attention span and the way people consume information, he's built for that. He's really good at that. You see certain politicians, AOC is terrific at this. Pretending she's not is not going to make her any less terrific at it. She really is very, very good at it. President Trump is really good at it. Right? And if you go to a President Trump rally for like 90 minutes or 2 hours and he's kind of rambling, by the end, everybody's like, oh man, this is taking a while. But then you watch it on social media and you're like, man, that's hysterically funny, right? I mean, like those 2 minutes are amazing. And so, you know, the way people consume information is going to determine, you know, who's capable of speaking into that medium.